There's a reason 2025 feels different, a reason why, despite low official unemployment and a growing stock market, millions of Americans feel like they're drowning. A reason why working full-time no longer means financial security. Why college degrees no longer guarantee a middle-class life. Why owning a home feels as impossible as winning the lottery. It's because we're living through a hidden economic collapse that mirrors 1929 in almost every measurable way. Not a stock market crash, not breadlines and soup kitchens, but a collapse of purchasing power, opportunity, and the fundamental promise that hard work leads to prosperity. The American dream isn't dying. It's already dead. We're just living in the aftermath, and most people haven't realized it yet. In 1929, the average American worker made about $400 per year. A new house cost $5,000. That's 3.6 times annual income. Healthcare was affordable because it was mostly basic. College was cheap or free for most. A single income could support a family. Buy a house, save for retirement. The system worked. Not perfectly. Not for everyone, but for the average person willing to work, upward mobility was real. By 1929, that system was breaking. Wages had stagnated while asset prices and living costs soared. The wealth gap had reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The stock market was at all-time highs while ordinary people struggled, and within months, it all collapsed into the Great Depression. In 2025, the median American worker makes about $60,000 per year. The median house costs $420,000. That's 7 times annual income, double what it was in 1929. Healthcare costs bankrupt families even with insurance. College requires decades of debt to attend. 2 incomes can barely cover rent, let alone save for a house. The wealth gap is the widest in recorded history. Billionaires are building rockets to space while families are choosing between medicine and food. The stock market is at all-time highs while ordinary people struggle. And the same warning signs that appeared before 1929 are flashing red right now. This is the story of how the American dream died without anyone noticing. Why 2025 is economically identical to 1929, and why what came after 1929, the Great Depression, should terrify everyone paying attention today. Let's go back to 1929 and understand what life actually looked like for ordinary Americans before the crash. Because the standard story is wrong. The story you learned in school is that the Roaring Twenties were prosperous. Then suddenly in October 1929, the stock market crashed and the Depression began. That's not what happened. The economy was already broken for most people long before the crash. The crash just made it visible. In 1929, the average American worker earned about $1,400 per year, which is roughly $25,000 in today's money, adjusting for inflation.
People
a modest house, a small 3-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, cost about $5,000. That's 3.6 times the annual salary. You could save for a few years and buy a house. You could get a mortgage and pay it off in 10 or 15 years on a single income. Your grandmother's generation did this routinely. College, if you went, cost a few $100s per year. Many state universities were free, or nearly free. You could work a summer job and pay for a year of college. Medical care was relatively affordable. A doctor visit might cost a few dollars. Major surgery might cost a few hundred. There was no health insurance industry because you didn't need insurance. You could afford medical care out of pocket. But beneath the surface stability, the economy was breaking for the working class. Between 1923 and 1929, worker productivity increased by 43%. That means workers were producing 43% more value for their employers, but wages increased by only 8% during the same period. All the productivity gains went to owners and executives. Corporate profits soared. Executive compensation exploded. Meanwhile, wages stagnated. The purchasing power of ordinary workers was actually declining in the late 1920s, even though the economy was supposedly booming. This created a consumption problem. How do workers buy the goods they're producing if their wages don't increase? The answer was debt. Consumer debt exploded in the 1920s. Installment buying became common. Buy now, pay later. Families went into debt to buy cars, appliances, and houses. Debt-to-income ratios reached unprecedented levels by 1929. The wealth gap by 1929 was the widest it had been since the Gilded Age. The top 1% owned 40% of the nation's wealth. The top 0.1% owned more than the bottom 42% combined. This level of inequality meant the economy was dependent on the spending of the wealthy. When they stopped spending, everything collapsed. And income mobility, the ability to move from working class to middle class to wealthy, was declining. If you were born poor, you were likely to stay poor. The latter was disappearing. So by 1929, the average American worker was facing stagnant wages, rising costs, increasing debt, growing inequality, and declining opportunity. The American dream was already fading. The stock market crash in October 1929 just revealed what was already true. The system was broken.
One lesson,
now let's look at 2025. The parallels should terrify
After the end of the
The
Korean
median
War,
American worker
North
earns
Korea
about
was a
$60,000
virtually
per
cashless
year. That's
society.
the middle.
Everyone
Half
worked
earn
for the
more,
state.
half earn less. The median house price in America is $420,000. That's 7 times annual income, nearly double what it was in 1929 relative to wages. Your grandparents needed to save 3.6 years of income to buy a house. You need to save 7 years of income. Except you can't save because rent and living costs consume everything. The average rent in America is $2,000 per month. That's $24,000 per year. On a $60,000 gross income, you're taking home maybe $45,000 after taxes. Rent is now more than half of take-home pay. In 1929, rent was about 20 to 25% of income. College costs have exploded beyond anything conceivable. In 1929, the average cost of a 4-year public university was manageable. Now it is over $100,000, including tuition, housing, and expenses. Private universities are over $200,000. In 1929, you could work a summer and pay for college. In 2025, you can work full-time year-round and not cover tuition alone. Student loan debt in America is $1.7 trillion. The average borrower owes $40,000, and many owe over $100,000. This is debt that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. It follows you forever. Unlike in 1929, when a college degree almost guaranteed a good job, today a degree guarantees debt and maybe an entry-level job, paying $45,000 if you're lucky. Healthcare costs are the most dramatic change from 1929. The average American family now pays over $20,000 per year for health insurance. That's 1/3 of median income just for insurance. And insurance doesn't mean healthcare is affordable. Deductibles are often $5,000 to $10,000. Co-pays are hundreds of dollars.
The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation,
cancer,
also known as the
accident,
FDIC,
surgery,
was
can
created
still
in
bankrupt you
1933
even with
during the
insurance.
Great Depression.
Medical debt is the
Our
leading
mission is
cause
to
of bankruptcy
maintain
in America.
stability and
In
public confidence in
1929,
our nation's
you could
financial
afford medical
system.
care out of pocket.
One
in
way we
2025,
fulfill our
medical
mission.
care can destroy you financially, even with insurance. Now, let's talk about productivity and wages, because this is where the pattern from 1929 repeats exactly. Since 1979, worker productivity in America has increased by 65%. Workers are producing 65% more value for their employers than they were 45 years ago. Wages adjusted for inflation have increased by 17% over the same period. All the productivity gains, just like in the 1920s, went to owners and executives. CEO compensation has increased by over 1,400% since 1979, while worker wages increased by 17%. The ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay was about 20 to 1 in 1965. It's now over 350 to 1. This is the same pattern as the 1920s.
According to
Productivity
IMF
increases. Owners take all the gains. Workers get scraps. The wealth gap in 2025 is now the widest in recorded American history. The top 1% own 32% of all wealth. The top 0.1%, that's about 130,000 households, own more wealth than the bottom 90%, which is 117 million households. This is worse than 1929. The inequality is more extreme than the Gilded Age, the Roaring Twenties, any period in American history. And just like 1929, income mobility has collapsed. If you're born into the bottom 20% of earners, you have a 7.5% chance of reaching the top 20% in your lifetime. The ladder isn't just harder to climb, it's been removed, so let's summarize. In 2025, the average worker faces stagnant wages relative to productivity. Housing costs double what they were in 1929. Unaffordable college requiring decades of debt. Healthcare costs that can bankrupt you. Inequality worse than 1929. And income mobility lower than 1929. The American dream that your grandparents had, where hard work meant home ownership, security, and upward mobility, is dead. You're working harder than they did and getting less. Not because you're lazy, not because you're not trying, but because the system is broken in exactly the same way as it was broken in 1929. Let's put the numbers side by side so the pattern is undeniable. Housing affordability. In 1929, the median house price was 3.6 times median annual income. In 2025, it's 7 times. Housing is twice as expensive relative to income. If your grandparents needed to save for 3 years to afford a house, you need to save for 6 years, except they could actually save 20% of their income. You can save maybe 5% if you're lucky. So what took them 3 years takes you 15 years. That's if housing prices don't keep rising, which they do. College affordability, in 1929, a year of college at a public university cost about $200, roughly 15% of average annual income. You could work a summer job making $400 and pay for 2 years of college. In 2025, a year of public university costs about $25,000, which is 42% of median income. To pay for 1 year of college, you'd need to work full-time for 6 months and spend nothing else. That's impossible. So you borrow and you borrow for 4 years, and you graduate with $40,000 to $100,000 in debt. Your grandparents graduated debt-free. You graduate in financial prison, healthcare costs. In 1929, a doctor visit cost about $2, less than 1% of weekly wages. A major surgery might cost $200, about 15% of annual income. Expensive, but manageable. No insurance needed. In 2025, the average family pays over $20,000 per year just for health insurance premiums. That's before you use any health care. If you actually get sick, deductibles and copays add thousands more. A major surgery can easily cost $100,000, even with insurance covering most of it. You might owe $10,000 to $20,000 out of pocket. That's 4 months of median salary. Healthcare went from affordable to potentially financially catastrophic. Wage growth versus productivity. Between 1920 and 1929, productivity increased 43%, while wages increased 8%. The gap between what workers produced and what they were paid was 35 percentage points. Between 1979 and 2025, productivity increased 65%, while wages increased 17%. The gap is 48 percentage points. It's worse now than in the 1920s. The theft of worker productivity gains is more extreme today than it was before the Great Depression. And debt. Consumer debt in 1929 reached about 30% of GDP, which was considered dangerously high. Consumer debt in 2025, including mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and auto loans, is about 75% of GDP. We're drowning in debt
This is
at
Max
levels
from
that make
UNFTR for the
1929
Midas
look
Touch
conservative.
Network. In our
Income
last several
inequality.
videos
In
here on
1929, the
Midas, I've
top
been highlighting
1%
some of
owned
the
40% of wealth. In 2025, the top 1% owned 32% of wealth. Wait, that sounds better, but that's misleading. In 1929, wealth was concentrated at the top 1% level. In 2025, wealth is concentrated even higher, at the top 0.1% and especially the top 0.01%. The ultra-wealthy own a larger share of total wealth than ever before in history. When you account for the concentration at the very top,
Japan has recorded
2025
another
inequality
steep
is
drop
worse.
in its population
And
despite
income
government
mobility.
efforts to
In
reverse the
1929,
trend by
about
income.
12% of people born in the bottom quintile reached
Japan
the
is
top
having
quintile
fewer
in their
babies
lifetime.
than ever
in
before.
2025, it's 7.5%.
So let's come home.
Upward mobility
the
was better
economy
during the
looks
lead up
pretty
to the Great
good.
Depression than
Could
it
be
is
growing
today.
as much as 4%.
The latter is gone.
I'm
The
looking
pattern
at
is
some
clear. Housing is twice as expensive. College is unaffordable, requiring massive debt. Healthcare is potentially bankrupting. Wage stagnation, despite productivity increases. Debt levels are double what they were in 1929. Inequality is worse than in 1929. Income mobility is worse than in 1929. Every single metric that broke in 1929 is broken worse in 2025. This is not a coincidence. It's the same structural failure. The system is broken in the same way. And what happened after 1929 was the Great Depression. What happens after 2025 is still being written, but the pattern suggests it won't be good. Beyond the statistics, there's a psychological element to why 2025 feels like 1929. It's the sense that the system doesn't work anymore, that the promises you were sold are lies, that no matter how hard you work, you're falling behind. This was the feeling in 1929, and it's the feeling today. In the 1920s, Americans were told that prosperity was permanent, that the stock market would keep rising, that economic growth would benefit everyone, and that hard work meant success. By 1929, ordinary people realized those promises were empty. Wages weren't rising, costs were increasing, debt was piling up, and the rich were getting richer while everyone else struggled. And when the crash came, it revealed what people already knew deep down. The system was rigged. In 2025, Americans have been told for decades that education is the key to success. Go to college, get a good job, work hard, and you'll have a middle-class life. Buy a house, save for retirement. But that promise is dead. People went to college, accumulated debt, and discovered jobs don't pay enough to cover rent, let alone student loans and savings. They were told homeownership is the American dream. But housing prices have increased so far beyond wages that homeownership is now a privilege for the wealthy or those with family money. They were told hard work is rewarded, but productivity increases aren't rewarded with wage increases. They go to executives and shareholders. This creates a profound sense of betrayal. Your grandparents followed the rules and succeeded. You followed the same rules and failed.
Not because you didn't work hard. You work harder than they did. Longer hours, more education, more productivity. But the system changed.
The rules were rewritten to benefit the wealthy at your expense, and nobody told you. You were still being sold the 1950s American dream in a 2025 economy designed to extract wealth from workers and concentrate it at the top. This psychological realization that hard work doesn't lead to prosperity anymore is what defined 1929, and it's defining 2025. There's also the sense that something is about to break. In 1929, people could feel it. The stock market was disconnected from reality. The wealthy were flaunting obscene wealth while ordinary people struggled. Credit was overextended.
Welcome to the Investors
Everyone
Trading
sensed the system was unsustainable, and they were right. In 2025, that same feeling is pervasive. The stock market is at all-time highs. While most people can't afford rent, billionaires are launching themselves into space while families are rationing insulin. The wealth gap is so extreme it feels medieval. Student loan debt is unpayable. Credit card debt is at record levels. Commercial real estate is collapsing. Regional banks are failing. Everyone senses something is wrong, that the system is on the verge of breaking. And just like in 1929, that sense is probably right. The final parallel is the loss of faith in institutions. By 1929, Americans were losing faith in government and in banks. The promise that the system would protect them. And when the crash came,
नमस्कार
that faith
साथियों,
died
स्वागत है आप
completely.
सभी का बातें
In
बाजार की पर।
2025,
होपफुली आप सभी ने
trust in
दिवाली बहुत अच्छे
institutions
से
is at
सेलिब्रेट
all-time
की होगी
lows. Trust in
और आपका
Congress is
सेलिब्रेट
15%. Trust in media is collapsing. Trust in banks never recovered from 2008. Half the country believes elections are rigged. The social contract, the implicit agreement that if you work hard and follow the rules, the system will reward you, is broken. People don't trust that government works for them. They see government working for corporations and the wealthy. This loss of institutional trust is dangerous. When people stop believing the system can be reformed from within, they stop participating in the system or they look for alternatives outside the system. This is the same trajectory as 1929. So what happened after 1929? The Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in American history. Between 1929 and 1933, GDP contracted by 30%, and unemployment hit 25%. Over 9,000 banks failed. Millions lost their savings. Foreclosures were so common that entire neighborhoods were emptied. Red lines stretched for blocks. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprang up in every major city. People were starving in a country that had been prosperous 4 years earlier. The Depression lasted a decade. It took World War II to finally pull America out of it. That's what happened when the economic structure that existed in the 1920s collapsed. But here's what people don't understand about the Depression. It wasn't caused by the stock market crash. The crash was a symptom, not the cause. The cause was the same structural problems we've been discussing. Wages stagnated while productivity increased. The wealth gap became extreme. Consumer debt exploded. Income inequality made the economy dependent on the spending of the wealthy. When they stopped spending, everything collapsed. The stock market crash revealed these problems but didn't create them. The economy was already broken. The crash just made it visible and triggered the collapse. The lesson from the Depression is that when you build an economy where most people can't afford to buy what they're producing, the economy collapses. Henry Ford understood this. He paid his workers high wages, not out of generosity, but because he needed them to buy his cars. An economy where workers don't earn enough to buy goods doesn't function. It consumes itself. That's what happened by 1929, and it's what's happening in 2025. Workers are not earning enough to afford housing, healthcare, education, the basic components of middle-class life. The economy is surviving on debt, consumers borrowing to buy what their wages can't cover. But debt is finite. Eventually, you can't borrow more. And when the debt stops flowing, consumption stops. And when consumption stops in an economy designed around consumption, everything collapses. The other lesson from the Depression is that the people in power didn't see it coming. In 1929, President Hoover said the economy was fundamentally sound. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon said stocks were cheap and a good investment. Irving Fisher, the most famous economist of the era, said stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau just weeks before the crash. The experts were wrong. The people in charge were blind. They believed their own propaganda. The same is true today. Every economic authority says the economy is strong. Low unemployment, GDP growth, stock market at records.
We've done specials
They point to the same
on
metrics authorities pointed to in 1929, and they're missing the same structural collapse. When the next crisis hits, they'll claim nobody saw it coming, but the warning signs are everywhere. They're just ignoring them. The American dream is dead. That's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. The promise that hard work leads to home ownership, security, and upward mobility is no longer real for most Americans. Your grandparents lived in an economy where a single income could buy a house, raise a family, and save for retirement. You live in an economy where 2 incomes can barely cover rent. They graduated college debt-free. You graduate with decades of financial burden. They could afford medical care. You can be bankrupted by illness, even with insurance. They saw wages rise with productivity. You see productivity stolen by executives and shareholders. This isn't because you're not working hard enough. It's not because your generation is lazy or entitled. It's because the economic structure has changed. The system that rewarded work in the 1950s and 60s has been dismantled piece by piece. Unions were destroyed. Financial regulations were removed. Tax rates on the wealthy were slashed. Wages were decoupled from productivity. Housing became an investment commodity instead of a place to live. College became a debt trap. instead of an opportunity. Healthcare became an industry designed to extract maximum profit. Every change made the system better for the wealthy and worse for workers. And the result is an economy that looks exactly like 1929. Stagnant wages, extreme inequality, unaffordable housing, massive debt, collapsing mobility. The metrics are identical. The structure is identical. The trajectory is identical. In 1929, the system collapsed into the Great Depression. In 2025, we're following the same path. The stock market is at all-time highs, just like 1929. The wealthy are richer than ever, just like 1929. Ordinary people are struggling despite low unemployment. Just like 1929, the warning signs are all there. The pattern is repeating. What comes next? If history is a guide, collapse. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not this year. But the structural problems are unsustainable. You cannot run an economy where workers can't afford to buy what they produce. You cannot run an economy on infinite debt. You cannot maintain social stability when inequality is this extreme. Something breaks. The question isn't if,
You're supposed
it's when.
to be selling
and
when
what
they're
comes
yelling,
after the
and
break.
the yelling in gold
After
is about the most
1929
extreme
came the
expense since
Depression.
1979.
After 2025
So
might come something similar or something worse. Because 2025 has problems 1929 didn't have. Climate change, geopolitical instability, technological unemployment. Debt levels are double what they were in 1929. The American dream isn't dying. It's already dead. We're living in the corpse, pretending it's still alive. Going through the motions, getting degrees that don't lead to good jobs, working jobs that don't pay enough to live, renting forever because homeownership is impossible. One medical emergency away from bankruptcy,
Day 17 of the government
drowning in
shutdown,
debt
and
and being
Democrats
told by
still
every
demanding an
authority that the
extension
economy is
to
strong,
Obamacare
that if you're
subsidies, while
struggling, it's your
Republicans say
fault, that you're not working hard enough. But you know the truth. The system is broken. The promise was a lie. And 2025 feels like 1929 because it is 1929. The same structure, the same inequality, the same unsustainable trajectory, the same warnings everyone in power is ignoring. Your grandparents lived through the
नमस्कार
Depression.
दोस्तों,
They
28
told
जून
stories about how hard it
1914
was,
एक 19
how
साल
people
का
lost
स्कूल में पढ़ने
everything,
वाला
and how the world
स्टूडेंट
changed.
ऑस्ट्रियो
You
हंगेरियन
might be about to live through the same thing, not because of bad luck, not because of some unpredictable crisis, but because the same economic structure that created the Depression in the 1930s has been rebuilt in the 2020s. The pattern is repeating. The American dream is dead. In 2025, it is 1929. If this opened your eyes to why everything feels so hard right now, why working full-time doesn't mean financial security anymore, why the promise of prosperity through hard work is broken, subscribe. Because when the collapse comes and the pattern says it's coming, you'll want to understand why. The answer is simple.